Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech. My name is Kevin Donahue. I'm president of the Board of Trustees, and on behalf of the entire board and the staff here at the club, I'd love to welcome you this afternoon to our regular Friday forum. Nixon-like. For a politician, there can be nothing worse than being described using that label. For a generation of Americans, that term became synonymous with words like ambiguous, corrupt, unethical, secretive, even criminal. This month marks the 30th anniversary of Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency. Whether you were around to witness that political turmoil in person or perhaps just read it in the history books, all of us can surely understand the impact of a presidency gone astray, of a president who once said, "I am not a crook." Today at the City Club, we have a rare opportunity to hear from a true insider of the Nixon administration. John Dean, perhaps the most famous of political whistleblowers, was closely associated with Mr. Nixon during those Watergate years, having served as counsel to the president. He witnessed firsthand how paranoia, thirst for power, and secrecy brought down a presidency and shook a nation. Mr. Dean, who proudly reminded me a little earlier that he is a Buckeye, having been born and raised in the Akron area, seems to think that old patterns may be emerging in Washington. And he's written a book to describe that. Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush. Mr. Dean has written numerous books, including Blind Ambition, the best-selling account of those Nixon years, The Rehnquist Choice, and most recently a biography of former President Warren G. Harding. Mr. Dean recently retired from his successful career as an investment banker and now writes and lectures full-time. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the City Club podium Mr. John Dean.
Let me make sure these little microphones are where they'll pick my voice up. I learned some years ago that little microphones pick my voice up very easily. You know, I tell that story because it gives me a good idea of the age of the audience. If you're over 45, you know what I'm talking about, and you laughed. If you're not, you might say, "What in the world is he referring to?" In fact, when I was in the Oval Office, it seemed every time I was there, I was sitting over a microphone, and my voice is one of those that on all the Nixon tapes comes through with remarkable clarity. I also learned I speak in sentences, which wasn't always the... I probably should be talking in Ohio about my Warren G. Harding book that I was actually working on when George Bush was finishing the election process and first ambled onto the scene. And I was finishing up Harding, and I began thinking about what was happening, and I also, when I decided I was going to start writing, I decided I'd do it full-time. I'd always wanted to return to writing, and I had, after a successful career as an investment banker, private investment banker, I was anxious to get back to something that was a little bit more cerebral and academic, because I enjoy that part of life. And I started writing a number of columns about what was happening in the Bush administration, sort of throwing up flares to indicate that maybe these people didn't realize the path they were going down that was so familiar to me. And the closer I looked, however, I realized they knew exactly the path they were on. So the book that I would ultimately write, and use a title which I never could have dreamed ever using again, is really, to me, not a partisan book, but it's a book that really raises issues of good government versus bad government. It's not a left-right book, it's not a Republican versus Democrat book, but rather it's a good government versus bad government book. In fact, what I did in assembling the material, I quickly noticed that it was the Republicans who were being the most outspoken critics of the obsessive secrecy of this presidency. In fact, flying to Cleveland yesterday, I noticed there was an op-ed piece written by Trent Lott, joined by a Democratic senator, in which he was very critical of the return to excessive national security classification of documents by this presidency and the need to really create some sort of commission or body that can declassify papers a little bit faster than now is the case. But anyway, when this administration did finally move into the White House, in fact, during the transition period, it's quite clear that they made a decision that they were going to be a tightly wrapped, I call it a saran-wrapped White House, where they were compartmentalized, highly compartmentalized, which prevents leaking, and everybody operates within that body on a need-to-know basis. So when I actually started on the book, I had some difficulty because I'm no longer an insider. While I understand what happens inside, not being an insider, I was only getting a glimmer and an instinct that this was awfully secretive. There were no press conferences being held. I noticed that new regulations were being written at a rather frantic pace, and I'm talking pre-9/11. The press was being shut out. They had moved into the White House, pulled the shades, closed the doors, and put a gag order on. Friends of mine in the White House press corps were saying it's never been quite this difficult to get a telephone call returned. So, as I say, I realized something was astray. I do have some friends who are a part of this administration, and they're very high-level people now in this administration who were feeling some very similar concern about the secrecy that was suddenly imposed on this presidency. And this was particularly acute for someone like me because in the aftermath of Watergate, we really did turn to open government. There was a steady trend that really started during Nixon's presidency, which was a relatively open presidency until Watergate. Nixon, when he came into office, in fact, when I went to the White House in July of 1970 to double-check and say what are the policies on executive privilege, what is the policy on cooperation with requests for documents from the White House, it was give them everything. I mean, give them what they want. Obviously, national security matters had to be closely screened, but generally it was just an open policy. In fact, Nixon actually started a study commission under the tutelage of the man who would later become Chief Justice, Bill Rehnquist, on how to declassify the mass of material that was classified at that point when he came in, because he said, it's absurd. We've got stuff that goes back to World War I that is still classified. We've got papers from Korea in World War II, and this material really needs to be released. Well, that attitude with Nixon somewhat changed with the leaking of the Pentagon Papers in the summer of 1971, where his initial reaction was, this is fine, let those papers go out, because the study of the origins of the Vietnam War did not reflect negatively at all on Republicans, but rather poorly on Democrats, so he said that's good. But Henry Kissinger, actually the papers leaked officially, and the White House learned about it the same weekend that Tricia's wedding was held. And when the president went in, the wedding was on a Saturday, when the president went into the office on Sunday morning to look at his New York Times, he was most interested in seeing the coverage that had happened on the wedding. And then he noticed in this left-hand column this study of this release of this study of Vietnam. And as I say, his initial reaction was, that doesn't look like any problem at all. But by Monday, when Henry Kissinger came back into town, Henry told the president that, Mr. President, this is a terrible problem. He said, I can't continue to have my back channel to the North Vietnamese in Paris. We might jeopardize our plans for going to China if China thinks we can't keep our secrets. And then he really hit what was a deadly button for Nixon. He said to Nixon, Mr. President, the world will think you're a weakling if you can't control this issue. Well, when he thrust, and Henry knew exactly what he was doing, when he put Nixon's manhood in the issue, the president was determined to do everything he could to prove to Henry what a man he was. And within days, we now know from tapes that he's pounding on his desk and ordering that there be a break-in at the Brookings Institute, of all places, a think tank in Washington where he believed they had some papers. That's when the curtain came down. That's when the Nixon White House changed. It was really a defining moment, not unlike 9/11 was for the present presidency. It really changed everything on that day. In studying it, though, what I found is that rather than making normal and appropriate adjustments for the threat of terrorism, and it is a real threat, that this administration has, after the first couple of weeks and sort of digesting what had happened, and I must also add that in the first couple of weeks I thought George Bush might be another Abraham Lincoln who had inherited a very terrible problem and it was going to bring out absolutely the best. But very quickly the light went off in the administration that this was political gold. And they have used 9/11 ever since for its political purposes, and they've used it to enhance the secrecy of this presidency. They had things in the works when they got there that are very troubling. For example, in the aftermath of Watergate, a law was passed after all of Nixon's tapes and papers were taken. The Congress focused on this issue of who do presidential papers belong to. And obviously they belong to the American taxpayer. That's who pays for them. That's who they're really generated for. And so the papers, indeed, the Congress said, should be turned over to the American people when a presidency is ended. A president, the Congress decided, should have 12 years to use those papers for his sort of exclusive purposes, for memoirs, defending any decisions he made. But after that 12-year period, then the papers need to be turned over and made available. Well, the first president for whom that law was applicable was Ronald Reagan. The first decisions as to the turning over of papers happened to occur in January of 2001 when George Bush came into office. His administration said, well, we need 60 days to study this issue to make sure that nothing is released that shouldn't be released. Anything of a national security nature would still retain that classification. So then he asked for another 60 days. It was said, all right, there was actually nothing that could be done because the papers were in the possession of the executive branch in the National Archives, so he just instructed the archivist to do nothing with them until he had another 60 days. Then soon he's asking for another 60 days, and what they're really doing in this period, we soon learn, is they're designing an executive order that will virtually repeal, and did virtually repeal when it was issued, the 1978 law making presidential records available. And that's the status of it now. I think one cannot but speculate that the fact that those papers cover his father's vice presidency, they cover that period of Iran-Contra when there were lots of issues about who was in the loop and who was out of the loop, and they also cover an awful lot of members of his staff. There certainly appears to be an ulterior motive in this decision. But right now, presidential papers are not available, and they've been bottled up. It's being litigated. The judge is hoping that it will be resolved. She's not issued an opinion. Some of the papers have been sort of trickled out, but still a lot are being withheld, and the issue has been fogged up because of the executive order. Another typical example I discovered when I really watched when I started studying it, it moved from the campaign right into the campaign activities morphed right into the White House policy. If not during the transition when Dick Cheney was designing the White House. Having been a former chief of staff for Gerald Ford, he knew where and what he wanted to do in designing a White House. Not that George Bush is a naif about these things. To the contrary, we must remember, and I learned this when I went to people to try to get inside information because I realized I couldn't address the subject of a secret presidency without having access to people who are in the inside, and I had to pledge to them that indeed I would not use their name because, as they reminded me, they said, listen, George Bush was his father's enforcer, first during his campaigns and later when he was president, and he wanted to get rid of his White House chief of staff, John Sununu. The person who was tasked to go tell Sununu it was time to leave was George Bush, our present president. People were saying that this man it holds grudges. He is not as sweet as he appears on the campaign trail, and we dare not cross him. So I was able, in constructing the book, to take inside information and then go find public documents to support the concerns that were being shared with me. And that's what this book really does, and it ranges a wide range of activity. Another one that I was thinking of during the campaign that I find terribly troubling, and is not unimportant because the vice presidential debates are going to be held in this city this fall in October. When Cheney was first announced or selected himself as the head of the selection committee to find a vice president, and the only person he could find suitable was himself, everyone knew he had a bad heart, that he'd had a quadruple bypass, that it was only seemed proper that his health information be released by the campaign. The New York Times and many papers asked for this information, pressed for this information. It was never released. During the final count of the Florida vote, or the recount of the Florida vote, however one views it, he had another attack and was hospitalized. Again, the campaign promised information. It was not released. Once he became vice president and the world realized we had one of the most important vice presidents we've ever had, in fact, as I describe, and I think rightly so based on the information I've been given, a co-president in Cheney, he promised again to release information, and none has really been released. We have almost zero information about this man's health. I happened to, the day I was having my own physical this year, I noticed that John Kerry had released all of his cholesterol counts and all that sort of thing. You don't get any of that with Cheney. And in my research, I found that people who have quadruple bypasses, and talking to some heart doctors, I was told that while it varies from person to person, they really give 20 years as being sort of the outer limit of when that operation can really be relied upon. Cheney's 20 years of his bypass is up this year, and I think we're entitled to a little bit more information than we've been given. As I say, he's the most important vice president we've had, and I call him a co-president not without study and not without justification. He has literally paralleled the White House staff in many areas. He makes many of the domestic decisions. It's a very interesting relationship between the two men, where George Bush is very good at campaigning. He enjoys the pomp and politics of the presidency. He's good at it. He cuts a nice figure in his suit. He spends some time in the gym every day, and it shows. He looks good when he comes out. He's bulked himself up pretty well now, and he likes being out there, and he likes to visit foreign potentates and what have you. He doesn't visit. In fact, one of the reporters that I quoted in the book said that unlike she had followed Bill Clinton, who, when he went to a foreign country, always mingled with the ordinary people of the country, whereas Bush, to the opposite, only will deal with the foreign potentate and foreign officials and has no time for anybody else. But he likes this part of the presidency. He's good at it. They've run a perpetual campaign, something that was introduced by Nixon, was not followed by all of his successors. Jimmy Carter didn't. George Bush Sr. didn't. Really, Reagan did to a degree. Clinton did to a degree, but nothing like we have now that is not unlike the Nixon years when, as I say, it's a perpetual campaign. I've kind of chuckled when I've heard from time to time that George Bush is now starting to formally engage in his campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, he has never stopped campaigning since January 4 years ago when he finally arrived in January of 2001 in the White House. It's been an ongoing, continuous campaign. Every decision that has been made by that White House. In fact, I have a former colleague who I do not name. As I say, I don't like unidentified sources. I don't rely on them. Occasionally for non-substantive points in the book, I did. One which was so explanatory to me when I asked somebody who has a lot of dealings with this White House and has dealt with Karl Rove, I said, what is Karl Rove really like? Because Karl Rove first came to my attention from the Watergate special prosecutors asking me if I knew Karl Rove or anything about him. And I said, no, I didn't. And when I was doing research for this book, I realized I wasn't the only person being asked when I looked at the files of the Watergate prosecutors about Karl Rove. He was being investigated at that time by the group of prosecutors who were looking at campaign dirty tricks. And it appears to me from sifting through those files that he was such a small fish that he went right through the net because, as I say, they had much bigger fish they were looking at, but that's when his campaign tactics and styles first came to my attention. So I said, what's he like? And the shorthand answer my friend gave me, knowing it would explain it all to me, they said, he's both Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Now, this crowd understands what that means. This is somebody who is obviously making policy decisions, making procedural decisions, and most of all, making political decisions. And every decision is being made, not unlike it was in the Nixon White House during the first term, as to how it affects a second term and the likelihood to win the second term. It's not government for the greater good. It's not government for the nation at large. It's government on how do you get reelected to a second 4 years. And I think it's pretty clear if one looks at the subtext of some of the lines what the agenda is for the second term. And this is all right if you're a partisan. It's not all right if you're concerned about good government. They're looking at how they can expand Republican power in every inch and corner of the nation and government would be the agenda for a second term. So these are all things that people have to weigh and think about. As I say, this is good for some who believe that's the way government should be run. I happen to be, when I moved to California, I registered as an independent. I had never voted a straight ticket even when I worked at the White House and was registered as a Republican, and I thought that really fits, and I no longer have strong partisan feelings. In fact, I worked very hard, for example, at trying to undo some of the damage that history has done to Warren G. Harding, who has taken a terrible bad rap. He's known as our worst president. It is unfair. It is because historians thought his papers were burned. That was incorrect. Florence Harding thought she had burned them all. She got one box. Most of all of his papers were preserved. His secretary, who had been with him since the Senate, had stuffed them in the basement of the White House. They sat there through the Coolidge and Hoover administrations, were discovered late in the Hoover administration, and then were shipped to Marion, where they sat in the basement of his house on Mount Vernon Boulevard, which I used to pedal by on my bicycle route as a kid, not knowing that one day would be wanting to look at those papers. And they're terribly revelatory, and as I say, I was able to clean up a lot of the misinformation about Harding. So I don't look upon any of this as partisan business. It's rather, how do we understand our history? How do we understand our politics? I happen to be reviewing a book that I'm not going to name right now because it won't be published for a few weeks, but by a newly minted historian who does something that has become too common. I've had a long-running debate with a number of historians, one in particular, a very eminent historian who I contend with him that lawyers are better trained in many regards to write history than are historians, who get very little work with critical thinking. They get a course in it, but they don't get the same feel for it as somebody who has worked with evidence, particularly any lawyers had any trial experience. I have had that, and I understand the rules of evidence and why they're there, and I think the same sort of standards need to apply when we look at some historical issues to see if they carry weight. What particularly got my attention was repeating a dubious claim that Christian Herter, as Secretary of State during the so-called U-2 incident, where Khrushchev shot down Gary Powers over Russia, lied to the Senate in testifying, and that his perjury had been suborned by Dwight Eisenhower. And that charge is made and argued, and it doesn't work. Any lawyer, just to get to the very bottom, it took me several hours to dig out, it was not for openers sworn testimony, so it couldn't have been perjury by definition. But these are the sort of little things that trouble me, regardless of what party a president might be in. So as I say, I don't approach this issue of secrecy. I don't approach the matter of tracking in this book some 11 different potential scandals that could erupt at any time in this presidency, and I guarantee you if Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney are reelected, they will emerge before the next 4 years are over. They're too serious to ignore. They are too troubling to ignore. In fact, any one or more of them could erupt before that. I don't know that that will happen, but still in the remaining weeks of the campaign, they could. We can get into some of this during the question and answer. There was one, however, scandal that I was tracking and had on my drawing board, if you will, when writing this book, that I took off. And I regret doing so now. I had learned from some lawyers who do work with international groups and with the Red Cross that prisoners were not being fully accounted for by the Americans in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq. And as I say, I carried that issue and I gathered material on it, but I just assumed, I said to myself, I don't know Cheney, but I do know Don Rumsfeld, and I can't believe that Rumsfeld would let anything like that happen when he had any role in the command at all. So nobody was more surprised when the pictures of the abuses have emerged. And I can tell you something else, because I am following that issue now. We haven't heard the end of that story yet from the reports that have been issued so far. The memos that have been leaked, I believe, from the State Department, showing the efforts to have the Geneva Convention not apply to any of these situations for the very reason that was stated by White House Counsel, to avoid the possibility of any of these people one day being prosecuted by a special prosecutor in the United States under federal law, in a clear effort to not make the federal law applicable. It was really quite a remarkable document. I can't recall anything quite that crude ever being put in writing during Watergate even. As I say, this issue isn't going to go away. One member of the Senate, at least, Senator John Warner from Virginia, is not going to let the issue go away. He's going to hold hearings. I believe he'll resume next month on this issue. And I'm afraid it's going to go a lot higher than it is right now. So that's one, as I say, that was not in my book, that I took off the chart by design. So with those remarks, we're now coming to another bewitching hour in your program format, and I will be back to answer any of your questions shortly. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to Mr. John Dean, former counsel to President Richard Nixon and author of many books, including Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush. Mr. Dean, by the way, will be signing copies of his books out in our lobby shortly after the forum has concluded today. Now we'd like to return to John Dean for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions, and once again, questions only, please, from everybody here today, including guests. Holding the microphones are membership manager Marcella Brown over on this side of the room. Over there's Marcella. And over on this side, our intern, Ben Moss. Can we have our first question for Mr. Dean, please?
Mr. Dean, you characterized Vice President Cheney as a co-president. Would you also characterize Condoleezza Rice and Karl Rove in the same manner? And would you also give us your impression of what the foreign image of this presidency is?
Those are multiple questions, part A, B, C, and D. Very good, well done. Let me compress A, B, C, and D, if I may, by just saying I think that Cheney stands alone and unique in his relationship with this president. He is somebody who I think one day history will tell us that there may have been the fine hand of Poppy Bush in his decision to have Dick Cheney become the vice president. From the little I've picked up, that appears to have been certainly a factor. I don't know how great a factor. What's happened, however, is that given the fact that Bush enjoys the pomp of the presidency, we've got to remember that our presidency really is, in a sense, bifurcated. We have a head of state, we have a head of government all in one. Bush likes the role of head of state. He does not have any inclination or interest or disposition towards being the head of government. That's the role that Dick Cheney has fulfilled. And he's done it, I think, with great genius for this reason. Not that I agree necessarily with some of his policies, but certainly procedurally he has done it. He has created, as I alluded to, his own staff. He has a staff. He has a National Security Council that the White House itself calls the shadow National Security Council. In some regards, it is as powerful, if not more powerful. It is as able, and in some areas even more able, than the statutory National Security Council. This gives Cheney, as I say, his own power base. The staffs are highly integrated, and you have something unique, for example, in Cheney's chief of staff also holds the title of the highest level you can have at the White House itself, being an assistant to the president, which is unusual. So he's an assistant to the vice president, an assistant to the president as well as being his chief of staff. The genius of Cheney is the fact that he understands the way the White House works. He understands the way presidents work. He appreciates that nobody seeks that job that doesn't have a fairly hefty ego to even undertake it. And I think Cheney has been very clever in letting George Bush wake up every morning and believe he is president.
Mr. Dean, maybe you have your hat on that can predict the future a little bit. We only have 2 months left of Mr. Bush's presidency. And what are the chances for Mr.
That sounds like a prediction right there.
Well, it's not a prediction, it's a fact, because we are going to vote. And I would like very much for your ideas of what chances we have not to see Mr. Bush as president anymore.
In other words, no second term for this president. I can say this to you. I certainly hope I don't have to write volume 2 of this book. It's a very close election. The country is very divided. I didn't totally hit part C, or the last part of this question over here, on how the rest of the world looks at us. And I think that is becoming a sort of a sub-issue in this campaign, because we've never had more enemies amongst our friends. I was recently spent 2 weeks in Australia. I was down there with this book, which was acquired by the Australians. Actually got to the top of their bestseller list down there. And they're very interested in what's happening in the United States. They're our friends. They count on us. They believe in us. They want this country to succeed, but they don't understand what we're doing. They don't understand how we can have the president we have. And this is a country that is not against war by any stretch of the imagination. They live under the threat of what could happen if Indochina rises up and decides to bring Australia within their range of influence. So they need America and its protection. But as I say, that hasn't emerged as a large issue in the campaign. But your question is, what can we do? As I say, I'm not a partisan in this situation. I think that I've never seen the Democrats more organized or together in their determination to defeat Bush. I also have a lot of undercurrents with my friends in the Republican Party who are distressed about some of the factions within the Republican Party. They're not happy totally with the neoconservatives having the influence they've had, largely through Dick Cheney, in the area of foreign policy. Henry Kissinger, who's coming here in a few weeks, is not, while he has a lot of friends, he'll tell you, amongst the neoconservatives, he won't subscribe to their thinking as to how to solve the world's problems. That they have departed from a lot of well-learned lessons and gotten the United States into a lot of problems with their policies. There are other spectrums of the Republican Party that not everybody is comfortable with on some of the social issues. So it's not a party that happens to be in many regards as united as the Democrats, but the Republicans really may feel they have no place to go, so it'll be a question of whether they come to the polls, and Bush is doing his best to stimulate his base to get everybody out. You've got to also put in context with a re-election of an incumbent. The first phase of the campaign is always an assessment of how people feel about those first 4 years. And then once making that decision, if they're unhappy, they look to see what the alternative might be with the person who's opposing the incumbent. If they are happy, they look no further. So we're in that process right now where people are assessing the incumbency, deciding what they want to do. I find it very interesting that Mr. Bush's campaign is doing everything possible to keep from focusing on the first 4 years. Question, please.
Mr. Dean, do you believe that there will again be problems with voting rights in Florida and elsewhere in this election?
Well, one of the things that was certainly committed to by this president in the aftermath of Florida and the last debacle that we had, really nationwide, with a number of voting mechanics. In this day and age, a country as far along and as technologically capable as this country, as organizationally as competent as this nation is, across the width and the breadth, the mechanics of voting should be a non-issue. But what's happened is the very fact that it doesn't work well has become an issue where neither party can quite decide whether they benefit or do not benefit by fixing the system. And they're getting conflicting reports. For example, in Florida, the Democrats sent out letters advising people because some counties had selected new computerized voting without paper records on the computers. Some have paper records. It's not uniform throughout the state, apparently, at this point. Some of the poor districts are still having trouble even going away from the old ballots, but there's nothing uniform again. And so the Democrats, as a matter of policy, were advising their people to vote by absentee ballot because it guaranteed a paper trail. Sure enough, the Republicans issued a similar letter urging that people vote by absentee ballot. So it shows that neither party is really quite sure what's happening, and it's a travesty that more federal aid and leadership hasn't been given to try to clean up a problem. And if it happens again, I think the American people are going to run everybody out until they can figure out how to get the basic and fundamental of our system in place and get it improved.
Mr. Dean, in your remark, towards the end of your remarks, you made reference that your research had brought out that there were some other potential scandals and issues that you think will be emerging in the second administration if it's reelected. And I thought I heard you say you hope maybe this, or maybe it will come out in the question and answer period. So I would appreciate very much if you could give some reference to it. And if you don't feel you can, unlike my colleague back here, who I do not agree with his politics, I would say I think you owe it to us, rather than just leaving it out and that hanging there. I hope you can be more specific.
Authors like to tease to what's in their books. But rather than go through all 11 that I deal with in the book, let me take one that's cooking and one that I'm following closely. That's the issue that's now in a grand jury about the leaking of the name of the wife of Joseph Wilson, who's a former ambassador who was dispatched by the CIA on behalf of the Bush administration to find out if there was any possibility that uranium yellow cake could be sold from Niger to Iraq, from which they could develop nuclear weapons. Well, Joe Wilson went. He found that there was no possibility, that so few people controlled the uranium in Niger. He's a former ambassador that had that country in his jurisdiction once. And when he came back, after Bush had announced mission accomplished, in other words, that the major fighting in Iraq had ended, he wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times in which he discredited the State of the Union message that made the case and built the case as one of the arguments that Bush had claimed that indeed there was uranium going to Iraq that would result in building nuclear weapons. To discredit Joe Wilson, the name of his wife was thrown out to Robert Novak, a reporter, a Washington reporter, who reported that she was a CIA covert operative in the area of nuclear proliferation, and suggesting that she had arranged for her husband to make this trip. Somehow this was to discredit the trip and the very fact that he had done it. I'm not quite sure why the thinking was that was a discrediting, but I can see some implications of it. The problem is that it is against the federal law to reveal covert agents' identity, and that's a very real reason. A man who has spoken here on a number of occasions, former President George H.W. Bush, as the director of the CIA at one point, when he went back to confirm or to attend the session where they named the CIA building in his name, it was at a time that this had become very serious because a number of disgruntled CIA agents were releasing the names of their colleagues, and Bush called this nothing short of treasonous to do. Fairly harsh judgment on it. The Congress then acted and adopted a law, but there are multiple laws to which this sort of revelation of a national security matter could actually apply. There is one rather specifically drawn statute that is not the easiest statute to prosecute because it was designed to to protect members of the media and their First Amendment rights to publish this information, but if they did it repeatedly, then they could become subject to the law as well, and the agent must be out of the country within the last 5 years. We don't have many facts about Valerie Plame, who is Joe Wilson's wife. That's her maiden name. We do know that she is the mother of his twins that are now at that rambunctious stage, and that she handles this very well with her job. We know that she was very good at her job at the CIA, and we know she handles an AK-47 very well. She is a true spy, if you will. She's somebody who was sent, somebody who we as a nation invested a lot of money in first testing to make sure she had the right intelligence, the right psychological bearing and attitude to undertake some of the most difficult work our country does in the area of covert operations. These people are people who have signed on because they are the best and the brightest, and they are willing to put their life on the line for their country. They go abroad, they solicit and get the aid of people in other countries who work with them, and they are the contact and the conduit through which they work. So to reveal this person's name not only reveals and threatens her, but it threatens everybody with whom she worked. So we don't know the full consequence of what might have happened by revealing her name. But after the administration dilly-dallied, finally by December of last year, the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, recused himself from the investigation. I think at that time what happened is they got a break in the case. Somebody at a mid-level had some information and told them who had leaked this information, and it resulted in the selection of a special counsel. They selected somebody who they wouldn't have to have a long clearance process with. They brought in the U.S. Attorney from Chicago, a fellow by the name of Fitzgerald, Patrick Fitzgerald. He has a good reputation as a prosecutor. He's a straight shooter, from all we know. And from what I've picked up in following the investigation is that he has never moved the investigation to Washington. He's run it out of Chicago. He's somebody who does not have particular sensitivity, I might say, to the protocols of power in Washington. And he's sort of a bull in the china shop, but, and is going places that I think that they wished he wouldn't have gone. He has forced the interview of Bush. He has forced an interview with Cheney. He forced them both to retain counsel. Ironically, they couldn't rely on White House counsel because Ken Starr, during the Lewinsky, first the Whitewater and then the Lewinsky investigation, blew away the attorney-client privilege in 2 circuits for government lawyers. The thought being by the circuit courts that a government lawyer has a higher duty to the public than he does to a client. So Bush had to go out and get an outside lawyer to even talk about whether he had any exposure or not. So the investigation has been going on. Colin Powell was called in front of the grand jury, and now we're in a process of calling the newspaper men who had the story, slowly but surely building up to Robert Novak, who we don't know because his lawyer won't talk, and he's not talking about it, whether he's been served or not yet. But I know a couple of reporters, and one in particular, who has legal training, who has been served and has not gone in front of the grand jury yet. And I said, what are you going to do? I said, you know as well as I do that under the current Supreme Court holdings that a reporter cannot withhold this information. He has to testify in front of a grand jury if asked. He said, well, my wife is baking a cake. So he said, I'm ready to go to jail if necessary. So he may have to spend, I think it's typically the life of the grand jury, which is probably about 18 months, if he wants to hold this. They've been able to negotiate it so far. Time Magazine's reporter testified last week that, and did it on a basis of Scooter Libby, the vice president's chief of staff, was the one they were interested in at this particular time, waiving And in fact, the FBI has gotten waivers from everybody at the White House to waive any kind of privilege for a reporter. So as I say, the thing is getting to the finer points now. It doesn't look like it is going to break before the election. In fact, it's Department of Justice policy not to have political cases indictments come down before elections. And we're within that cycle. It's probably close enough there's nothing going to happen until after the election. But let's stay tuned. Next question.
Your talk, the role you played in the Nixon White House, and certainly your testimony before various committees of Congress and the investigating powers was a very important factor in the ultimate departure from the White House of Richard Nixon. My question is, if there were a clone of John Dean in the White House today, to what extent do you think the same result would happen, the same departure would happen that happened to Richard Nixon?
Well, I see a little bit of that in Richard Clark, in his decision to come forward. He was actually a career person who had come from the bottom and risen very high to a cabinet rank in his handling of terrorism. He disagreed with the way the Bush people were handling terrorism, so what he did is ask for a transfer in position, and finally, when he was unable to have any persuasive powers within, he broke rank and has been very forthcoming and has suffered the consequences of all who do break rank, of being tarred, feathered, and every effort made to discredit him. Nobody likes to have to blow the whistle. It is not something that is pleasant to do. I was young enough, and in fact, a lot of my friends have said, if you'd been 60 instead of 30 at the time, in your early 30s, you might not have done what you did. And I said, I don't agree with that totally, because the reason I broke rank was that I was unwilling to live the lie. I just couldn't envision having to keep this lie alive indefinitely. It would just eat at me. And in coming forward, I thought that by doing so, I would force Nixon and the others to come forward. In fact, everybody for whom I had any respect in that administration, I told them eyeball to eyeball exactly what I was going to do and why I was going to do it. No one believed I would remember as much as I did. My files were sealed and kept away from me, making it as handicapped as possible to testify. I had no clue there was a taping system that would later corroborate my testimony. In fact, I under-testified for that very reason, because while you wouldn't recall it, what I did do I did testify to the fact that I thought I had been taped. And it was unusual I put that in, because in pulling together my testimony, I tried to do no speculation. I tried to use no hearsay. I tried to only report things I had firsthand knowledge of. But at one point I decided, I do think that I was taped in a couple of conversations, at least because of Nixon's behavior. In fact, I would get questioned before the committee at one point about that. By, I think it was Howard Baker, or one of them, said that, please tell us about this fact you think you were taped during this conversation. I said, well, yes. I said, what happened is Nixon was asking me one leading question after another, and he was leading me into areas that were exactly the opposite of what I knew had happened, and I wasn't agreeing with him. I'm saying, no, that isn't the way, the assumption of your question is not right. And finally Nixon gets up, and he was sitting in an easy chair. We were actually over in his hidden office in the office of the Executive Office Building, and we were there, and he gets up from his easy chair, and he goes over to a far corner of the office, and literally there's a potted palm over there, and he talks around the potted palm at me, and he says, John, I was foolish to talk about clemency for Howard Hunt. To talk to Colson about clemency for Howard Hunt, wasn't I? And I said, yes, you were. But what happened at that moment, I realized he's over there to be away from a microphone, and he's taping me. And he just wanted to get this answer for an honest reading. So as I say, later, when Butterfield revealed the fact that there was a taping. What happened is Butterfield was asked in an effort to discredit me and my testimony. They said, it was one of the minority was saying they were trying to discredit anything I'd said and everything I'd said. And they said, well, Dean made this charge. He thought he was taped. That's crazy, isn't it, Mr. Butterfield? And Butterfield said, well, he might be right. And the rest is history, as they say. One last question before we finish up here. Is that it? Good, thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland Forum, we have been listening to Mr. John Dean, former counsel to President Richard Nixon and author of the book Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush. Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned. Have a good day.